Hi there. This is just a supporting video for our talk today, particularly if you wanted just to think a little bit more about how to think about the Old Testament and the New Testament, the difference between the two. And I'm only going to talk very briefly about it. It's a huge area, of course, but it's just worth noting the differences from before Jesus came to after Jesus came, so that we can really take on board some of the things that we can learn, and God would have us learn from Nehemiah. Because Nehemiah, of course, was a man on a mission. He had stuff to accomplish for God, and ultimately he wanted to see the people of God restored and renewed in their vocation. He wanted them to be all they were destined to be. And that's exactly what we continually want, isn't it? We want to be the people that God has destined us to be as Christians day-to-day living, but also as the church. And in Nehemiah's day, the destiny of God's people was bound up in being on the land and being self-governed on the land, the promised land that God had promised way back when to Abraham. And that was really important. And in fact, even when Nehemiah gets the folk back, or some of the remnant back to Israel, to Judea, even then they're not quite there, because they were never fully self-governed apart from a very short time when the Maccabees ruled. And we know that they didn't really feel like they'd fully got back from exile because of the words of Zechariah that are very familiar from Christmas. 400 years later after Nehemiah, Zechariah prays, "This was the oath God swore to our father Abraham, to set us free from the hands of our enemies, free to worship him without fear, holy and righteous in his sight all the days of our life." There's that longing for freedom. And that's why a number of people in Jesus' day, the disciples, were still looking for this sense of the nation of Israel in those borders in Judea as being part of the purposes of God. And they were, of course, part of the purposes of God, but for a limited time. And that's why Nehemiah was so keen to get back, because of those purposes, destiny for the people of Israel at the time. And that's, when they were in exile, that they were sort of torn apart. They were separated from that purpose. And that's why it was so painful when they thought of Jerusalem. You remember that psalm, "They sat down on the rivers of Babylon and wept." How can we sing the Lord's song when we're in a foreign land? And for Nehemiah, Zerubbabel and Ezra had paved the way, but he wanted to finish the job. And of course, when we think about ourselves as Christians in the church, well, things are different now. How are we going to apply the lessons of Nehemiah to ourselves? Because the walls for Nehemiah were really important. The walls enabled society to function. So you knew who was coming in and who was going out, and you could have some measure of control on that. And then you think of all the marauding forces that might be around. Well, the walls provided protection. One of the most basic needs, isn't it, that we have as humans is for security, so that civic life can function. And the equivalent, I guess, for us today to walls, because I don't think Eynsham needs a wall and Cassington doesn't need a wall. The equivalent is the rule of law and the police to enforce it. And I guess that's where we note some of the differences between Israel and ourselves as the church. So there is this integration of civic matters and religious matters in the people of Israel. Whereas in the church, well, in the early church, Christians were living all over the place in all sorts of different societies. There is a kind of a separation. in many ways, we do sometimes talk, don't we, about our own country and say, some people will still think we're a Christian nation, but most of us realise that's not the case. But some will hark back and say, we wish we were still a Christian nation. Well, I'm not sure that you can have a Christian nation in that sense. I do long for a nation that is mainly Christian or majority of Christian, because that's my conviction. That's certainly true. But there is a difference between the way Israel operated in the purposes of God for a time, that a Messiah might be born, and the way that we operate. Israel and Nehemiah were largely focused on this territory that they had been given. Whereas when Jesus came, well, everything expanded. Suddenly the whole world was invited in. In fact, where you have the promised land for Israel, well, now you have the planet and the promise of new creation. What was once modelled in Israel is now expanded to the whole world. The real thing, as it were. God's great new redemption of the whole of creation. And where there was once a people, well, now, through Jesus and Pentecost, now all nations are invited. Every tribe, tongue, and language and nation. This great expansion of all that God is doing. But there are some things that we do share with, the many, many things that we do share with God's people as Israel, and now. There is great continuity as well as discontinuity. Nehemiah was not only thinking about building a wall around Jerusalem, but for the nation of Israel to restore and renew its vocation, to be a beacon of light to the world, to say this is how we live God's way, and to explore and to proclaim who God is, and understand him more, and understand who we are and how we are to relate to God. This is what Israel was supposed to be living out, and to live out some of God's priorities, and thus to proclaim him again. So this is the kind of God who looks after the marginalised and the poor and the weak and the vulnerable. This God cares for these kinds of people. This is how you live in society. You care for these kinds of people. And they also were called to declare God's glorious purposes to each generation, and to give hope to the world of a God who has promised way back to Abraham again that he will bring a beautiful blessing to all nations. And well, we do inherit that, don't we, from Israel? Very much so. And Jesus reinforces it in the New Testament when he says, he gives us that great commandment and the great commission. He says, love God with all of your life. Order your lives of worship. Love your neighbour as yourself, your neighbour both near and far. Live out the way of Jesus, the way we were always destined to live. True humanity. Explore that together. That's discipleship, isn't it? And as you do that, people will see something of the beauty of Christ. And finally, to spread the message. That's in the Great Commission, isn't it? To go teach and make disciples. Let everyone know that it's not restricted. In fact, it was never restricted just to Israel. I mean, it was just hints and pre-echoes of God's plan. But you think of people like Nineveh and God's mercy on them, and how Jesus, his genealogy has all those non-Jews involved in Jesus' genealogy. So what was once restricted there is now for all. The invitation is thrown open after Pentecost and the coming of the Spirit. For Nehemiah and the returning exiles, perhaps you do need some security in walls, but no longer. If the church retreats behind walls, well, that's a tragedy. For the message is to go out to all nations and to the communities in which we live. In fact, somebody pointed me to Zechariah 2 after last week's sermon, and it's spot on. Do have a read of it. But one part says, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. So since the time of Jesus, the time for walls is definitely over. But we hold on to that vision for a renewed and a restored vocation for us, and particularly as we progress through this pandemic and emerge out of lockdown. We want to be praying together. Renew our calling as a church and as Christians. Where we have strayed from the ways, bring us back to the central things that you would have us be about as your people, as your church in Eynsham and Cassington. Thanks for listening.